next up, Jess Shanahan. So happy that you could join us. We've been following, it's kind of a relationship. We've been following on Twitter, just impressed with the frame of mind, you know, your thoughts, your opinions, your journey. And I really just want you to talk about yourself. And please, everybody, give Jess a warm round of applause.
Thank you. So for those who don't know me, I am a linguist turned astrophysicist. It was quite a journey already. My research is in extragalactic astronomy. I focus on a class of objects called active galactic nuclei, which are really, really big black holes at the centers of galaxies that are munching on things. Pretty cool stuff, but maybe outside of the scope of lunar exploration. Part of my job as well is as a science communicator. I have published articles in Forbes, Astronomy Magazine, Science, talking about a wide range of topics. Some of which are a little more science fiction, like potential linguistic tactics for translating languages that did not originate on Earth, which David brought up some great points about MEDI and about the need for peer review when it comes to the process of creating messages that we send into outer space. I also have a deep random love for Enceladus, which he also mentioned, and its potential habitability is of great importance to me. But I'm here actually to talk to you about something a little bit different. The other hat I wear is as an accessibility consultant and a disability rights activist. And you might be asking yourselves, what does disability have to do with space? But I hope by the end of this, I can convince you that there's quite a lot to learn from accessibility and accessible design when it comes to how we get to space and what we do when we're there. So I'm not going to tell you the nitty-gritty details of how to build a warp drive. I'll leave that to the experts. And I'm not going to tell you how to build a lunar base. But what I would like to tell you is how we can design those things to make sure that we truly are saying that space is for everybody. It's great to say it, but to actually make it a reality, it requires a lot of thought, and it requires a lot of care into how we design the various elements of that process. So to give you a story from my childhood, like Mike, I am a big fan of video games. And as a child, the video games that most caught my eye and grabbed me were ones where I could build a civilization, or a city, or a society. And the more control that they gave me and the more power they gave me, the better. But I was a benevolent dictator, I promise. But there was a unique opportunity that these games gave me, which was that I could start fresh. There was a completely blank slate. There was no existing infrastructure, no laws, no culture. All I had was usually some ground and some money. Money is good. But what I found out was that my favorite parts of those games were the beginning. The part when you could, by design, from the very beginning, avoid a whole lot of problems. Obviously, I learned that by failing many, many times. The parts of the games that I disliked were the levels where they gave me a failing city, a failing civilization, and they said, fix it. It's a lot harder. It's a lot harder to clean up somebody else's mess. It's a lot harder to look at a bunch of problems and come up with solutions rather than avoiding the problems in the first place. Space is a lot like those video games. There's no infrastructure there. So far, there's some laws, but maybe not enough. We have this incredible opportunity not to fix the societies we have on Earth, per se, but to start over, to do it right, to show that we've learned our lessons from our failures. And as Mike said, this isn't something to berate ourselves about, to be angry, to hate ourselves for the mistakes we've made, because any educator knows mistakes are part of the learning process. I hate that these mistakes have caused pain, these mistakes have caused violence, but if we learn from them and we do better, then maybe they're not all in vain. So when it comes to looking at space as our final frontier, we have possibly the only opportunity left to start over. Everything that we do in space is a first. And that means that any society that we create, any colony that we found, will also be a first. It will be like those initial levels in my favorite video games. It will be completely from the ground up. And so we need to do it right. We need to learn from what's not working on Earth. And so I'm going to dip into some harsh truths about maybe what's not working on Earth. And this isn't, again, as Mike said, I think he made such a great point. This isn't to hate ourselves. This isn't to make everybody angry and contentious. This is to say, as anybody who has fixed something knows, you need to know the problem in order to fix it. And these are just simple facts about life here on Earth that I would prefer we not take with us when we go to space. So again, coming back to disability, I think a lot of people, when I start talking about disability in space, they still don't get the connection. What does a disability have to do with space? In fact, the way that human beings on Earth in our society view disability is something that is holding us back as a species, and it's holding us back in our efforts to go to space. So, to back up a little bit, how do we view disability? So largely, it is viewed as a negative. It's viewed as a burden for somebody to overcome. It's viewed as something that holds you back. And there's a lot of discrimination and oppression that results from this belief that there is one way to be human. There's one way to do humanity. There's one way to think. And even beyond the idea that that one way is being white, it's being male, and it's not having a disability, there's also this connotation that there's one way to think. And those of us who work in education see the real consequences of that in our classrooms. That this idea that our students should learn one way, they should all think the same way, should they all perform the same way on the same assessments. It's just not true. And we're losing brilliance, we're losing talent because we are selecting for a singular way to be human, a singular way to think. And as scientists especially, that just, it makes no sense to me. We should encourage different views. We should encourage different ways of thinking. How are we going to solve problems if we all think the same way? So that belief that there's this one way to be human has some very, very nasty consequences. You might think, okay, all right, yeah, I've seen some of this discrimination, I've seen some of this, selection for one way of thinking, but it's not that bad. So I'm going to dip into some horrible details. And bear with me, because I think my message is overall a positive one. But as anybody who's done a physics problem knows, you need to look at your known quantities first. And only from that can you move forward. And so we're going to look at some known quantities. One of the ways in which we use this norm, this one way of being a human being, against each other is to associate deviance from that norm with criminality. So here in the US, as many of you know, we have a problem with mass shootings and violence. Whenever one of these atrocities happens, one of the first things I always see the media do is start to speculate on the mental health of the perpetrator, even if nothing's known, even if nothing is known about his mental health. And statistics say otherwise. 95% of homicides are committed by a neurotypical person, not somebody with a mental illness. In fact, people with mental illnesses are 14 times more likely to be the victims of violent crime than to be the perpetrators. and this association of disability with criminality or with violence means that we start to pathologize any deviance from that norm. So whether it's being black, whether it's being a woman. I mean, you only need to look at the history of psychology to see that being a woman was considered deviant, hysterical, the history of institutionalizing women for ridiculous things. This has been a weapon that has been used to force people to adhere to that norm. And if you can't, we'll throw you in jail or an institution. Not only that, but it leads to this idea that if we have the power to edit our population to fit that norm, we should. And that sounds drastic, that sounds wild. You might be thinking, who the heck thinks that? I would like to share with you a 1927 court case in the United States called Buck v. Bell. And Buck v. Bell centers around a 18-year-old intellectually disabled woman named Carrie Buck. She was the daughter of a sex worker who was declared unfit to be a mother because of her promiscuity. And so Carrie was adopted, and while in adoptive care, she was raped and got pregnant. And the family, because this was shameful and awful, institutionalized her, where her doctor said that for the betterment of society, she should be sterilized against her will. Her caregivers protested, and the case went all the way to the Virginia Supreme Court of Appeals, where the following decision was handed down by Justice Oliver Holmes, Jr. He said, "It is better for all the world if society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kind. 3 generations of imbeciles is enough." And again, here's that idea of that norm again. It's their kind. It's this othering, this process by which we look at people with a trait that we don't have and go, they're not us. And that is, it flies in the face of everything we try to accomplish by saying space is for everybody. It either is for everybody or it's not. So unfortunately, as of 2017, that case has yet to be overturned. And effects from that belief that somehow thinking differently, your body functioning differently, means that you have less of access to your human rights, it continues today. In the United States, it is legal to pay disabled people less than minimum wage. Not only less than minimum wage, but often less than $1 per hour, because work done by a disabled person is somehow of less value. There's also, if anybody here has studied philosophy, then they've probably heard of Peter Singer. Very prominent philosopher. If you haven't heard of him, take my word for it. His writings were required in pretty much every intro philosophy class I took in college. Intro to ethics, intro to Western philosophy, intro to philosophical writing. He was required, one of the most prominent modern philosophers. He has also said the following: "Most people think that the life of a dog or a pig is of less value than the life of a normal human being. On what basis, then, could they hold that the life of a disabled human being is of equal value to the life of a normal human being?" Again, that norm, right? It's not just that we're saying, if you think differently, maybe you're going to get worse grades. We're literally starting to argue that if you think differently, if your body works differently, you're not a human being. And one, I just can't. I don't know how this is somehow a belief that we still have to argue about. But two, if we're ever, and I dream of this, going to interact with other species in space, thinking that way is not a great start. If we're starting to think, you're not worthy of respect, you're not worthy of rights because you're different, that's not going to be a good first contact. So, unfortunately, Peter Singer even goes further to say that disabled people cannot be victims of sexual assault because if they can't conceive of consent, then how can you experience sexual assault, which I'm not going to open that bag of worms. So what can we learn from these atrocities, right? Like, I don't want my talk to be all about the bad things. But we do have to look at our society and go, there's things that aren't working. There's things that we need to leave on Earth when we go and start anew. And what I want to leave you with are a couple of guiding principles. So when you sit here and you're listening to talks about how we build our spaceships, how do we find resources, how do we start a colony, these wonderful, inspirational questions that are why we're all here today, I want you to think about a couple of things. First is an idea called the social model of disability. And this is where I believe that we can learn very much from disability rights when we go to space. This model says, rather than getting into the nitty-gritty of this is a disability, this is not a disability, which I get asked a lot, and it's a very frustrating question. Instead it says, there are multiple ways of being a human being, all of them equal. There's multiple ways to think, all of them acceptable. What causes the disability, what is the disabling process, is society. So, classic example, whenever I talk about accessibility, most people just go, ramps. Ramps are great, but there's more to it than that. But yes, make sure your spaceships have ramps. If you think about a person in a wheelchair is not the obstacle, and I've been there. When I entered into my master's program at Wesleyan University, I used a cane. And one of the first things that I noticed was all of the entrances to the observatory had stairs. All of the ways to get to use the telescopes had stairs, some of them incredibly steep, spiraling, and dangerous even if you didn't have a disability. So right there, the building's very design told me, you're not supposed to be an astronomer. This isn't for you. But was the obstacle me? Is the obstacle my genetic condition? It's not. The obstacle is the stairs. What causes disability are these barriers that we've written into society. It's the way that we structure things so that only some people, only normal people, can access it. So how do we fix that? How do we move beyond a process that so severely limits all of us? The answer is inaccessibility. And this is a buzzword I see thrown around a lot. And so I want to define it for you because I think it needs to have a very specific meaning. When I Googled accessibility space travel, the only thing that came up was talking about money, which is an accessibility issue, yes, and we should all talk about how to make space travel affordable. But there was not a single mention of disability, not a single mention of how to be more inclusive to everybody. But yes, finances are important. Accessibility is the way in which a person navigates, interacts with, and engages their environment. So in a classroom, and I keep coming back to a classroom because I am an early childhood educator in my past. And I have had a lot of experiences where children have been labeled as problem children. And especially in elementary school, you know, there's the teachers talk. And as a student moves through the grades, they get a reputation. And my mom, for instance, is a 6th grade math teacher. And every year, the 5th grade teachers will clue her in as to the problem children. When my mom was a new teacher, she was kind of put off, like, what are you talking about, problem children? And very quickly, she discovered that the problem children were black. The problem children had learning disabilities. But because they didn't conform to this one way to be human, one way to learn, they were labeled as a problem, when in fact, these kids are brilliant. These kids are going to be the problem solvers of the future. But we're telling them you're a problem because you think differently. I keep remembering this example. I am going to mess this up. I believe it was Euler, who in like 5th grade or something, he was very young. He was given a problem where he needed to sum all of the numbers from 1 to 100. And the teacher had given the problem, I think, because they were probably tired and wanted the kids to work on something for a while. Been there, done that. But Euler went about it a very different way. Instead of sitting there and going 1 plus 2 plus 3, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, for quite a long time, he paired numbers. So 100 and 0, 99 and 1, 98 and 2, finding out that you could make a whole series of pairs that all added up to 100. And then you only need multiply those hundreds by the number of them to get the answer. He was done in minutes. That teacher was not happy. I can empathize with needing students to be busy and them not being busy and that being a problem, but when we react to innovation with criticism, with derision, we're holding ourselves back. And so you'd think we'd learn, you know, looking back and seeing all of the famous minds throughout history who've been labeled problems, who have been chastised by teachers, who have failed classes because they're bored. You'd think we'd learn by now that maybe there are different ways to solve problems, and the people that have those different ways are going to be the people that are going to push us forward. And so, with this idea of accessibility, there comes a couple of core tenets, and these are the concrete tools that I want to leave you with as you listen to talks, as we go into our hackathons and we start to solve problems. These are the guiding principles that I want you to take with you. One is multimodal access. Cool buzzword. What does it mean? Multimodal access says that there are many different ways to access content or to access an environment. By providing all of these different ways to do it, you not only enable more people to engage, but you enable new and innovative ways of using that content. So for example, we can take our typical college lecture. I've been through many a bad physics lecture where my ways of accessing the content are an archaic textbook or the drone of a professor who seems like he's really bored and doesn't want to be there. On the flip side, I've been in physics classrooms that are starting to do it differently, where I can access the content through several different textbooks. I can access the content through video lectures. I can participate in the class not just by raising my hand and being verbal, but by writing responses, by participating in a forum. And there are many different ways for me to be assessed. It's not just god-awful timed college lectures. There's also, your problem sets, a research project, a paper. And studies in education have shown that the more ways you give students to perform, the more avenues you give them to engage with content, the better they do. And this isn't because we're making it easier. We're just saying, hey, maybe you don't access content the best by reading a really boring textbook. There are some of us who actually really like the boring textbooks, but they will always be there for us. But it doesn't mean that if you don't really get a rise out of that textbook that you're stupid, that you're bad at physics, which I was told in high school. I had a split-sex high school, and they couldn't find a female physics teacher to teach the girls, so the boys' physics teacher had to teach the girls, and he was not pleased about it. And I was struggling with understanding how to set up and solve a physics problem, which is something I really wish intro physics teachers would go into more, is how to solve a problem, how to set it up, how to approach it. Because to me, I was just sitting there like, yeah, I get your lecture, but then there's this problem, and like, how do I make the connection? And he goes, well, you're just bad at physics. Dude, I got some news for you. I'm not bad at physics, and I use it actively in my research now. The only difference is that I found professors who were willing to explain things a little bit differently. Were willing to let me learn in the way that my brain works, and not the way that we have somehow decided that every brain should work. So multimodal access is not only ways to engage content, but it's ways to access a space. So it's the idea of providing not only videos and in-person lectures, but maybe offering audio files, transcripts, giving people as many different ways to approach and engage with the same content. And so to take this into space, which is that's why we're all here, we can think of this not only in, okay, how many different ways can we design a spaceship? How many different ways can we provide our astronauts interfaces to engage with information? How many different ways can we get to space? How many different ways can we build structures once we're there? I mean, think about 3D printing. That's been one of the new amazing ideas that I've read about as a possibility for creating fast, cheap structures on another planet. It's also used in prosthetics. It's also used in classrooms. If we shut ourselves off from anything that doesn't already say space science, how are we ever going to make progress? The other guiding principle that I want you to keep in mind is that of universal design. This is another one of those great buzzwords. If you Google it, there's plenty of information out there. But universal design basically says, hey, there's a really interesting trend. When you design things to be accessible for disabled people, everybody likes it. Everybody benefits. And so coming back to our idea of ramps, maybe there's a ramp to that observatory. And yes, if I use a cane or if there's a scientist in a wheelchair, which incidentally, our professor emeritus was in a wheelchair, couldn't visit the observatory where he worked for decades. But let's say you don't use a wheelchair. Let's say you have a stroller. You still can't access that space, a space designed for education and outreach and learning, and you can't bring your kids. So when we start to think about different ways to give people to access a space, when we think about how to make things accessible with disability in mind, there's this cool bonus, which is that everybody benefits. Things become better for everyone. So with that in mind, those are the two things I want you to remember. And not only that, but accessibility, again, is thrown around in a lot of non-disability contexts. But I would caution you to remember that it is in the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights as one of the protected rights of every human being on this planet. So every time that we design things inaccessibly, when we deny people access to something simply because they think differently or their bodies work differently, we're violating their human rights. And not only that, but again, thinking in the science fiction realm, thinking ahead to the future. If we ever engage with another species that is vastly different than our own, if we can't even provide for our own species, if we can't even create something accessible for our own species, how the hell do we expect to do it for something else? For something that's vastly different than our own? Like, if we can't even do this, like, how do we expect to have productive dialogue to create spaces where multiple species can interact? And so, a couple of final thoughts. I want to impress upon you, again, the unique opportunity that we all have. That space is this incredible final frontier. It is a tabula rasa like nothing we have on Earth. It is a complete opportunity to do things right. And if we say space is for everybody, if we say we want to act in the best interests of all humanity, then that needs to be true. And this is how we prove it, by, from start to finish, keeping accessibility in mind. Because it's not a box to be checked at the end. And I've seen that done, like, oh, we've designed this whole thing and, oh crap, disabled people. Okay, how can we make this accessible after the fact? It never works. And it's also more costly. So if we start from the beginning and we hold on to those principles all the way through, not only is it more efficient and cost effective, but that principle of universal design, it'll be better for everybody. And there's one last quirk of space that I want you to think about. And that's that everything we do in space represents us as a whole, whether we like it or not. It's that idea of these firsts. That yes, there's a lot of political drive to plant a flag here, plant a flag there, be the first of this country, But Neil Armstrong didn't say it was one giant leap for Americans. It was for humanity. Everything that we do in space is for humanity as a whole. We're given a chance to correct the mistakes of the past, to not repeat them, and to do it right. Let's not waste it. Thank you. Are there any questions? Imagine people are hungry. Yes. The documentary?
Have you seen live the science fiction movie that was out, I think, like half a year ago? I think it's one of the first science fiction movies where you have one of the main characters who's disabled.
How have I not? I've seen Life, the David Attenborough narrated.
No, it's a kind of action.
Everything that
action
man
movie.
says
Anyway,
is-
I'll give you the reference. You should
Okay,
check
yeah,
it out.
please do. Thank you. I think there was a question. Yeah.
As an architect from the United Kingdom, I can just speak from experience of building code accessibility. And when you prepare now a planning application, there's a thing that goes alongside it, which is called a design and accessibility statement. It's a booklet, really, that goes with it. And it kind of goes along the lines that you're not just thinking about accessibility in terms of ramps, things like that. It goes about the lifetime of the building. And you're thinking about the changes of its use, its occupancy patterns, accessibility in terms of fittings and fitments that you might need to change for the user and for the maintenance of the building. And I think that's part of what you're saying. It's about transparency. It's about going logically from day one, when you have your plot of land and your allocation of money, and you set out thinking first, what are all the possible things that could happen here? And you do this selection and rejection. It's I hate saying advantages, disadvantages. It's kind of better to do it as a what's the word? Throwing me here. Sorry.
It's okay.
Opportunities and constraints.
Okay.
It's a nicer way to say advantages. So you look at what fundamentally is your aim, your objective with that project, and I like to think that accessibility is about inclusivity. You're thinking about all of the possible opportunities that project has to offer, and you're doing it for the benefits of everybody.
Yes.
And so I think that's something that I personally have a connection to, which is why I think you're spot on with your presentation. It's a different mentality that we need to all adapt to. And
Yes, and I mean, as kind of a corollary to that, though, one point that I would suggest thinking about is that it requires that process of brainstorming all the possible things that could go wrong or all the possible barriers to access. And it's just a fact of life. If everybody is able-bodied and neurotypical, they're not going to think of all the possibilities. And there's this guiding principle in the disability community that is nothing about us without us. And so as we work towards accessibility and we work towards developing this mindset, we can't do it without the people who experience this. Because we need that expertise, we need that lived experience to guide how we do our designs. So, yeah, thank you.
one more point just about iconography of accessibility too. I find it a little troublesome that iconography of disabled person is in a wheelchair, and that is fundamentally wrong, because I know from, again, my mother, she was born with a collapsed lung, and she has a limitation in her ability to walk distance, and it's not shown through something exterior. There's what you mentioned with audio-visual impairments. There's so many things that can be a factor in people's accessibility in their space, in their environment. And I think it's very important that we share those stories with others to make them aware that maybe when we go ahead in our designs, that we should better plan for the whole the whole array of options.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And
you.
this was really interesting, actually. I co-founded the Working Group on Accessibility and Disability for the American Astronomical Society. And when I was presenting the proposal to the executive council committee. There were two responses that really stuck with me. One was a gentleman who spoke up and said, I've just never thought about this. It's like, dude, before I became disabled, me too. I never thought about it. And then the interesting thing about disability that differentiates it from race or gender or sexuality is that you can't get hit by a bus and wake up black. But you can wake up disabled. It can happen to you at any time. It can happen to all of us. And it's something that you can move in and out of. And so it's this very unique kind of marginalization because of that. The other interesting response I got was an older gentleman who had served on the committee for a very long time. And he said, I'm so glad you're bringing this up. I have this specific kind of color blindness. I've never been able to read any of our pie charts. I mean, this guy's been there for years serving on this committee, and the big stack of studies and stuff that they hand out to open the meeting, he can't read them. I mean, so not only is that indicative of a lack of access, it's also indicative of this mindset of like, you shouldn't speak up. Like if you speak up and you say, hey, I can't do X, it's somehow admitting personal failure or weakness, which is again that idea of deviation from a norm as being a defect. But I think about those two responses a lot because one gives me hope, strangely enough, is that the gentleman who said, I've never thought about this, I thought, okay, how much of this is just ignorance? How much of this can we fix with just education and outreach? Like if you're aware of these problems, if you're aware of these issues, how much accessibility can we initiate simply by telling people, guys, there's a problem here. I know you don't see it, I know you're not aware of it, but trust me, it's there. And the flip side of that being, of course, that like you mentioned, not all disabilities are visible, and that's something I get hit with a lot is, you're not in a wheelchair, what do you mean you're disabled? Like, well, I went from the hospital pretty much to my flight, so it's a unique experience. And being invisibly disabled means that you lose a lot of the perks of being visible, but also I guess I don't get harassed in the streets, which is nice, except for being a woman, but not being disabled. But what that means is that there's way more to disability than simply just existing and using a wheelchair or using any kind of mobility aid, and that we do a disservice to people who have stayed silent. And that's something I didn't get a chance to talk about, but I have a couple articles coming out on this very subject, which is that the weirdest thing about starting to talk about disability with a group of scientists is the people that came up to me afterwards to say, I've been hiding this for decades. I have MS. I have, a joint disease. I have rheumatoid arthritis. I have lupus. And I hide it because if I didn't, I would lose respect. I wouldn't get the opportunities I'd have. People would think I can't be a scientist. And that shocked me. Because I started talking and raising awareness before I really had the depth of experience that I do now. And it's a very weird sensation to be like 21, 22, junior scientist, not a lot of experience under your belt, and having tenured professors come up to you and go, in tears, I've hid this for years. Like, I'm so glad I can tell you about it. And you're just like, okay, this has got to change. So you bring up a lot of really good points. And I wonder if being from the UK, and working as an architect, I wonder if you heard recently about there was a large tenement building, and and a bunch of disabled people died because there was no accessible fire escape.
No, they
caught on fire and they all burned to death.
They sadly tragically relied on these wheelchairs that you push down the stairs and you push up the stairs, which have got like a kind of teeth. And,
okay.
and there was only I believe less than a dozen in the whole building, which is a catered occupancy for 200 people.
Guess we didn't learn from the Titanic, huh?
It's a Titanic story. It is. In fact, I live about maybe less than half a mile away.
Oh wow! Okay.
I mean, being there in the morning of it, it was just something. It was a moment that I would never forget, like being in school at the time and coming home and seeing the 9/11 attacks.
Yeah.
watch.
Everybody remembers what they were
It's
doing.
one of those moments in
Yeah.
life, and I've only got maybe 2 or 3, and that was one of them. So yeah, thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. We'll take a brief break here.
I just want everybody let everybody know my water is on. My water's on.
You know, I've never heard that talk in all the space science conferences I've been to. Can we get another hand for Justin Shanahan? And so we've got a 15-minute break? Yes. Okay, break time. Coffee's in the back.